Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation for the 10th Annual International Conference on Second Language Studies. So the title of this presentation is Embedding SEL into Pre-Service ESOL Teacher Education. So my name is Dr. Brian Hibbs. I'm a professor of education / ESOL at Dalton State College in the United States. So to give you a bit of a background about myself, so I regularly teach courses in applied linguistics, language teaching methodologies, and culture education, and to pre-service elementary education teachers. And so the goal of these courses is to prepare them to work effectively with multilingual learners of English in their current / future instructional practice. And as you can see from this list, so my scholarly interests include a wide variety of areas relating to different aspects of language pedagogy, also different areas of the intersections between language and culture from different perspectives, and also several different approaches to different research methodologies as well. So the focus of this presentation is SEL, or social emotional learning. So I think a logical place to start would be to just spend a little bit of time just thinking, exploring what SEL, what social emotional learning is, how it's been understood, and several different different frameworks for understanding SEL. So one definition that exists several scholars that have defined social emotional learning is Beecher et al. 2022, looking at SEL in a much more general sense. And so they define social emotional learning as the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that assist in managing emotions, establishing and maintaining relationships, and making responsible decisions. And so what I think is important about this definition is focusing, and we will see this in a number of different times throughout the presentation, is that social emotional learning focuses on the interpersonal, so managing and one's emotional states with respect to interpersonal exchanges, connections with other people, but also the intrapersonal, so thinking about how to handle one's social and emotional states oneself. And so what I like about this definition is it's really kind of highlighting both of those aspects within SEL, within the approach. Specifically within the realm of education, Jones and Doolittle 2017, so they define social emotional learning as children's ability to learn about and manage their own emotions and interactions in ways that benefit themselves and others, and that help children and youth succeed in schooling, the workplace, relationships, and citizenship. So what I like about this definition is, again, not only highlighting both the intrapersonal and the interpersonal aspects of social emotional learning, but also thinking about the aims that not only help students with respect to education and developing their academic competencies, but also really beyond that, thinking about the future with respect to their professional context that they will be engaging with in the future, but also society as a whole, and looking at really thinking about the role that social emotional learning can play in all of these different contexts. So thinking about the literature review on this area, specifically with respect to SEL and teacher education, it's important to think like, well, why is social emotional learning so important? And there are several arguments that could be made with respect to that. One is given by Schonert-Reichel et al. In 2015. They contend that growing students' social emotional competencies are vital since the very nature of school-based learning is relational. Really focusing on, because oftentimes school learning is seen as kind of more individual, introspective, intrapersonal, really is focusing on the individual student. But what they are contending is that school learning really is inherently social. And so that school-based learning is really based on the relationships, the connections, the exchanges that happen between people. And because of that, and because as we mentioned, or as we discussed earlier, that there's one aspect of SEL that is really focused on managing the interpersonal. So having students develop their own social emotional competencies It can really help them handle and manage and effectively interact with others in a variety of different ways. Specifically with regard to multilingual learners of English, Penton Herrera 2020 makes the argument that SEL is particularly important for multilingual learners of English because, in addition to having them acquire the linguistic competence with respect to English, the English language, he contends that English learners have to also discover how to navigate the unwritten rules of the social emotional landscape of American society. So not only do English learners have to acquire the linguistic competence and communicative competence in English, but they also have to simultaneously develop their cultural competence, so their ability to interact effectively with speakers of English, but also understand, respect, and to acknowledge the norms, behaviors, values, etiquette, etc., regarding interpersonal exchanges in American society. And so that it's important for English learners, SEL can help them develop that intercultural competence that they need to effectively interact with speakers of English. And I would imagine that even though Penton Herrera's argument is really with respect to American society, that there is a similar pattern existing in other countries as well. So the SEL framework that really framed this study is the SEL framework developed by Castle, and so which is a collaborative on a social emotional learning. And so they identify 5 different aspects of social emotional learning, but also where these 5 aspects of SEL should be embedded across different contexts and different layers. So they identify 5 aspects of SEL. So for example, self-awareness. So one, again, that intrapersonal aspect of things. So where students become aware, become conscious of and familiar with their own social emotional states, the triggers for certain emotional responses and ways, but also learn about ways to effectively manage and handle those emotions in effective ways. Secondly, social awareness, so the same sort of idea, but also sort of in interpersonal contexts. And so I'm also being able to understand and empathize with other people, their background, knowledge, experiences, etc. And so ways to effectively manage interpersonal relationships. Thirdly, relationship skills, so the ability to not only initiate, but also establish and maintain social connections, relationships, exchanges with other people, and the importance of doing so. Fourthly, responsible decision making. So thinking about different decisions that they make in their lives, doing so responsibly, ethically, but also not being guided by their gut social emotional response, but really thinking through things in a more logical sort of way. And finally, self-management. So being able to not only understand their social emotional states, but their ability to regulate those and handle those emotional states. And so these 5 aspects of social emotional learning should be embedded intentionally across different contexts. So for example, in the classroom, where students should be instructed, should be taught about SEL, why it's important, but also sort of the practical aspects, so ways to manage their own emotional states in intrapersonal and interpersonal contexts, but also where educators need to establish a classroom climate where students feel supported, but also where their emotional states, but also their cultural and linguistic backgrounds and identities are acknowledged, valued, and understood. SEL should also be embedded institutionally, so school-wide culture, practices, and policies. So that SEL should not exist sort of in a vacuum in individual classrooms, but should be intentionally incorporated across all aspects of an institution, and so that all people from the principal to the janitors and everybody in between, stakeholders within a school, should be invested in the social emotional learning of students. Also, sort of between families and caregivers, so that relationships should be established between students and their families, the households that they are a part of, in order to extend the social emotional learning that has been initiated in schools, but also develop the social emotional competencies of the households of these students as well. And then finally, at the community level, so where there should be intentionally created learning opportunities for students to utilize and practice their social emotional competencies in various political, social, institutional aspects of the community, and really enforcing those relationships with other community stakeholders as well. And so this was the framework that really guided the current study. So although there has not been a lot of research that's been done about SEL and its role in teacher education, there nevertheless have been several studies that have explored this idea. So for example, Donahue, Keegan et al. 2019, in their article, they talk about the establishment of the Massachusetts Consortium for Social Emotional Learning and Teacher Education. And really the goal of this consortium was to not only encourage educator preparation programs to intentionally embed SEL into their programs, curricula, courses, etc., but also to work with the State Department of Education to establish SEL standards that would become part of teacher certification. And so the consortium really had three overarching goals. So one is that EPPs, educator preparation programs, should equip teacher candidates with the skills and strategies necessary to manage their own emotions. So again, that intrapersonal aspect, but really not only within the context of them as going through an educator preparation program, which in itself can often be a stressful experience with courses, assignments, practicum, student teaching, etc., but also instilling in them the development of their own social emotional competencies to handle the daily stressors of teaching once they become in-service teachers. Secondly, they found that teachers with social emotional learning competencies are more likely to promote the development of these competencies in their own students. And so, as we mentioned earlier, we've talked about the importance of developing SEL competencies of students. So logically, it really starts with the teacher candidates. And so if the pre-service teachers themselves are competent socially and emotionally, they will more likely believe in the importance of doing so for their own students. Additionally, they also found that teachers who are socially and emotionally competent are more likely to deliver instruction that is culturally relevant and culturally responsive. And so really taking into account students' linguistic and cultural funds of knowledge, so to speak, but also making sure that the content of their lessons are connecting in important ways to students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds. And so teachers that are socially and emotionally competent are more likely to do so in their own teaching. So the current study that's the focus of this presentation took place in the fall semester of 2023. This took place at Dalton State, which is a post-secondary four-year small college post-secondary institution located in the southeastern United States. The unit on social emotional learning was embedded within a TESOL methodology course. There are 53 participants that engaged in the study across two sections of the TESOL methodology course that was taught that semester by myself. The participants in the study were elementary education teacher candidates or pre-service teachers who wanted to eventually teach primary grades upon graduation. And so the study really was focusing on students' perspective of the logistics of the implementation of a multi-module course unit on social emotional learning for English language learners, and really looking at students' perspectives regarding what they felt were the strengths and weaknesses of the course unit. So the research question that guided the current study was, how does a course unit on the social emotional approach for English learners contribute to pre-service elementary education teachers' beliefs about social emotional learning? And so really looking at participants' perspectives regarding the contribution of this unit on social emotional learning to their own perhaps social emotional learning, but also their understanding, their awareness and understanding of the approach and its importance for students writ large, but also more specifically for multilingual learners of English. So the course unit on SEL consisted of three modules. So the first week, or the first module, focused on a general introduction to social emotional learning. So was basically sort of a lecture where I gave a presentation on social emotional learning, what it is. We had a discussion on that. Looked at the SEL framework that I shared earlier, and which led to a class discussion on that. The second and third weeks then focused on doing the teacher candidates doing different readings on social emotional learning and engaging in a jigsaw reading activity, which I will explain in a minute. So the second week was really focused on the I would call sort of like the theory, so the underlying principles that frame the approach, and specifically why SEL is important for multilingual learners of English, sort of at a theoretical level. And then the third week, so participants read and discussed a variety of articles looking at ways to more strategically embed social emotional learning into their own instruction with English language learners. So in weeks 2 and 3, a jigsaw reading activity was implemented in both those weeks. And this jigsaw activity consisted of a multi-step process. So first, students were separated at the beginning of the semester, before the course unit was implemented. Students were randomly separated into 4 different groups, A, B, C, and D. For weeks 2 and 3, each group read a specific either blog post or article about social emotional learning. And so what they did is the first step, they got into groups with students who had read the same article, what are called the expert groups. And so they discussed their responses to the reading that their group had conducted, but also what was the most important points of information included in those readings. Then they were organized at a step 2 into home groups, so where there were groups of 4 students each, but each group consisted of students from different expert groups. And so where you had groups of 4, but where each student in the group of 4 had read a different article. And so they presented their reading to the rest of the students who had not read the article, with the intention of not only creating sort of this class community where we're teaching and learning from each other, but also where all students were benefiting from some of the learning from all 4 articles without necessarily having to read all 4. Then the third step, they returned to their individual seats. They were given blank index cards, and they wrote a short reflection on what they learned from the whole process of the jigsaw reading, their respective groups' article, and then engaging in the jigsaw reading activity. And then they shared out that learning with classmates both at their table and then across the class as a whole. And so this jigsaw reading activity was implemented in the second and third weeks of the course unit. So the methodology of this study, so data was collected via a pre and post unit questionnaire, which was exactly the same. Which was included the teacher SEL beliefs scale that was established by Brackett et al. 2012. So this teacher SEL belief scale consists of 12 Likert scale statements that concerns not only some of the statements concern teachers' beliefs about the social emotional learning approach and their perspective regarding the approach, but also where there were several statements that concern the institutional support for social emotional learning in different contexts. This scale was slightly adapted in the sense that originally it was proposed as a 5, on the sort of like a 5 scale items, but for the purposes of this study, it was extended to 6 scale items. So it was a Likert scale from 1 to 6. This was following the advice of Nemoto and Begler, who contend that traditional Likert scale item statements from 1 to 5, there's this middle position that is 3, which often is neutral. And so where students can sort of sometimes, or participants can sometimes select that position where they're not necessarily committed. They don't have to take a side, whether they agree or disagree with the statement. But using something like a 4 scale or a 6 scale statement items can not only expand the possibility of students' responses to a given statement, but also where they have to at least minimally agree or minimally disagree to a statement. So they can't, it forces them to take a position to some level regarding whether their level of agreement or disagreement with the statement. So some preliminary results from the pre and post course questionnaire. So overall growth across the 12 statements. So by participants in class number 1, there was 71.1% more agreement with the statements on the post questionnaire versus the pre-questionnaire. In the second class, there was also substantial growth, but not quite to the same level, as you can see, 51.9%, which means that the participants in class number 1 demonstrated 19.2% more agreement with the 12 statements on the post questionnaire than the pre-questionnaire. Perhaps there could be perhaps a number of reasons why this finding was obtained. Among other reasons, perhaps participants in class number 1 felt that even though the same logistics of the course unit were exactly the same across both sections of the course unit, it's possible that the participants in class number 1 felt that the approach was more beneficial and more relevant for them. And we will see in a minute that this sort of overall trend sort of held across a number of different statements. And interesting, another overall trend that was observed through the analysis of the data was that although participants in the second class had more positive responses to the statements overall, as you can see, even though because for 12 of the statements, participants in class number 2 demonstrated positive growth in 11 of those statements, versus in class number 1, several of the statements were actually rated negatively, more on the disagree side. But despite that trend, as you can see in class number 1, there were more positive responses just overall, which was kind of an interesting trend to notice. With respect to several specific statements, there are several statements that kind of followed the same pattern that was explored, that we just were exploring, but also where there was some substantial divergence between participants' responses to particular statements. So, for example, regarding statement number 12, the educator preparation program does not encourage the teaching of social emotional skills to students. Participants in class number 1 were 15% more likely to agree with that statement in the post questionnaire versus the pre questionnaire, versus in class number 2, there was 5% less agreement with that statement. So going in two different directions. There are a number of perhaps sort of reasons for that, but one is possibly that perhaps because of the course unit, the implementation of the course unit, perhaps participants became aware not only of the social emotional learning approach and its importance, and perhaps recognized that even though they developed some understanding of SEL within the context of this course unit, that maybe perhaps they recognize that this is not embedded institutionally, as we kind of saw earlier at that level of the SEL framework, that perhaps this is sort of an isolated implementation and is not implemented systematically across the whole program. Another statement where there was some divergence regarding students' perspectives was regarding the first statement. So the educator preparation program expects teacher candidates to address children's social and emotional needs. Participants in class number 1 were slightly less likely to agree with that statement on the post questionnaire, versus in the second class, students were slightly more likely to agree with that statement. So there is some disagreement about some level of disagreement about the extent to which our department is actually encouraging where teacher candidates are actually learning about how to address the students' social and emotional needs. And so that's a part when we get to the discussion that is an important point to keep in mind moving forward. But interestingly, there were a couple of statements where there was some largely agreement across the participants in both sections. For example, regarding statement number 4, I would like to attend a workshop to develop my own social and emotional skills. Both classes demonstrated a 7 to 8% more agreement with that statement after the course unit than before. And perhaps this there could be potentially other reasons, but I think one reason perhaps that this finding was obtained was because after the implementation of the course unit, perhaps teacher candidates became somewhat more aware of SEL, what it is, why it's important, and important for themselves and their students, and so wanted to continue the initial learning that happened during the course unit. So that was an interesting finding. So to provide a sort of discussion, so overall trends from the study. So as we mentioned previously, so participants in the first section were substantially more likely in comparison to participants in the second section, were more likely to believe that the course unit made a substantial contribution to the awareness of SEL, its approach, and it's important for multilingual learners of English. And as I mentioned, there are a variety of reasons perhaps for that. Interestingly, as we also explored, participants in the first class were much more likely to believe that the program does not encourage the teaching of social emotional learning. And so that's a really, I think, really significant finding in really highlighting the importance of more intentionally and strategically and systematically incorporating SEL into in our educator preparation program, not just in sort of a pocket sort of fashion where it's sort of these isolated pockets of discussion of SEL, but it needs to be done more comprehensively and more systematically. And so that's an important finding from the study. Also, where there was, as mentioned previously, there was a mixed response on whether the program expects teacher candidates to address students' social emotional learning needs. And so I think this is important because perhaps students are maybe getting a mixed signal that in some parts of the program they are taught that social emotional learning is important, versus in other areas of the program perhaps it isn't addressed at all or addressed minimally. And so this highlights the importance of our program, the necessity to be much more, as I mentioned, so more comprehensive, more systematic, more strategic in embedding SEL across multiple aspects of the program. Nevertheless, as we saw with the last statement, participants overall indicated more agreement that the department creates an environment that promotes social emotional learning, and that they are interested in attending further professional development on SEL for themselves and their students. And so I think it's important to really address both of those aspects, not only to more intentionally create a supportive environment within our educator preparation program that promotes not only for teacher candidates to not only learn about SEL in ways to teach their own students, but also really to focus on their own social emotional learning, but also providing more opportunities for students to learn about social emotional learning in different ways. So there's several implications for this study. As mentioned earlier, Donahue, Keegan et al. 2019 really emphasizes the fact that there's current dearth of attention on cultivating social emotional competence in teacher education programs in the United States. I imagine in the other countries this perhaps might be similar. And so really highlighting the importance of really of incorporating social emotional learning in educator preparation, but there's very few programs that have done so. Schonert Reichel et al. Sort of 2015, they also emphasize a similar point. They mentioned that little attention is given currently to the cultivation and promotion of pre-service teachers' own social emotional competence and well-being. And so really highlighting the point that SEL really does not figures prominently in very few educator preparation programs. And so Moreno et al. Sort of call for a change in educator preparation, where they contend that the time has come for educational leaders at every level to work towards high quality training opportunities in SEL for teachers and to advocate for SEL pre-service and professional development efforts. So really they're kind of Moreno et al. 2019 are really proposing a call for action to really change the situation, really, or where they're encouraging teacher educators to promote sort of this paradigm shift where social emotional learning must be much more strategically and comprehensively integrated into teacher preparation. So, and also, and because of this study, I proposed several suggestions for further research in this area. So Gogan et al. 2017, they argue that there has been surprisingly little research that empirically examines teachers' beliefs about their own socio-emotional competencies and subsequent relationships with beliefs about SEL. And so the intention of this study, among others, was to address this curricular and programmatic gap, but also this sort of methodological gap by really looking at the possible contributions of a unit on social emotional learning on pre-service ESOL teachers' beliefs about the approach. As mentioned earlier, there is a predominant amount of research on social emotional learning, but predominantly the participants in those studies have been primary and secondary students. Very little research has been conducted on the integration of social emotional learning into teacher education in general, writ large, but more specifically regarding the field of ESOL teacher preparation. And so, as mentioned previously, that was one of the aims of the study, was to contribute to that body of knowledge. So more research, of course, needs to be conducted in this area more generally in teacher education, but also thinking about several avenues for further exploration in this area. So for example, more research needs to be conducted on what are the best practices for integrating social emotional learning into teacher preparation writ large, and then ESOL teacher preparation more specifically. Since very few programs are integrating SEL in EFL contexts, it's not really known what are the best practices, what are the best ways, what are the optimal ways to integrate SEL into teacher education. And so more research really needs to be done on that. Also, more research needs to be done on examining the contributions of social emotional learning to pre-service and in-service teachers' perceptions of their well-being. So this was looking at this study was looking at teacher candidates' perspectives regarding the SEL approach on their instructional practice, but it was not really looking at their perceptions of their own social emotional learning and their own well-being. That is an area that really needs to be looked at as well, and looking at what are different ways that SEL might contribute to pre-service teachers' own social emotional learning. Also, there is little research about the effective implementation of social emotional learning in ESL/EFL classrooms. So similarly to the first point, there's not a lot of there's a lot of research on different ways that scholars and researchers have implemented SEL in ESL/EFL contexts, but there really hasn't been like this big lit review of what are the most effective ways of implementing ESL in these contexts. So more research needs to be done in this area. And then finally, also, what are the successful strategies for advancing multilingual learners of English SEL competencies? As mentioned previously, that the vast majority of the students in SEL studies are non-English non-English language learners. And so it's important to think about, do those strategies and techniques, approaches also work or not work for multilingual learners of English, and in what ways do they work or not work for this student population? So thank you very much for watching this presentation. Hopefully it has inspired you to think more about your own social emotional learning, but also, if you're a teacher educator, to really think about ways to more strategically and intentionally embed SEL into your own educator preparation context. So thank you very much.